just give us an introduction of yourself and like what you do?
Sure. My name's Louie Porta, and I run the Marine Conservation Initiative for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And presently, we're focused exclusively on the Arctic Ocean.
Mm.
Prior to that, I have a long history of working in the Arctic, starting one of Canada's most significant ocean conservation organizations, Oceans North,
Oh,
and the first civil society organization focused on environmental conservation in Greenland, Oceans North Kalina Nunat. Prior to that, I lived and worked in the high Arctic as a marine scientist, but that feels like many lives ago.
how was it? I'm so curious, how was it working in the Arctic?
I mean, the Arctic is, how do I explain this? I always feel like the Arctic is a place where there is are great upwellings of life
Mm.
and then relative calms. And that's not just a metaphor for how species come and go seasonally, but for how conversations take place around oil and gas, commercial fishing, mining, shipping, and all of those play out through very intense dynamics on coastal communities, often boom and bust dynamics, which are very hard when you're trying to create a healthy place that can be healthy in the long term. But the thing that stood out to me the most was that every single Arctic community in Canada, and there are 52, are places where people went and have lived since time immemorial, like we've heard earlier, because they were the great intersections of life. They
Mm.
were the places where you could access marine mammals and fish and caribou and bears. So the physical location and presence of people was itself a metaphor for the well being of the environment.
Mm. I was curious, you mentioned like mining and drilling and things like that. What is like the most immediate threat to the Arctic right now? And is like there anything we as youth can do about that?
Great question. I mean, there's of course an existential threat around climate,
Mm.
which we are seeing in a increasingly changing environment. But what's going to be left in whatever condition that we're in is still a very healthy and productive ocean. So, what you can do is to put this issue in your consciousness and in your collective action and those who you talk to, the places that you advocate for, and ask people to do something. The Arctic needs a lot of help, but the right kind of help,
Mhm.
informed help. It's a very well studied place, but it's often a spot where people come trying to help and they take things away and they don't leave something there. So that's one around the issue of climate. When it comes to the bigger conversation about all the different things that we do to mess up our environment
Mhm.
because we need stuff in other
Mhm.
places, those conversations are really, they're kind of spotty. So it depends on where you're talking about.
Mhm.
If you're talking about North Baffin Island, you have the largest iron ore mine going on anywhere in the Arctic, shipping almost 18 million tons of iron ore through narwhal habitat. In the sort of port of Churchill, which we'll see in the film later, you're seeing a real push to modernize a port and start shipping LNG out of there.
Mhm.
In other places, you see a continued search for commercial fisheries. There was always an expectation among people who live in the Arctic, call it home, and whose rights and title go back for centuries, that commercial fisheries would play a meaningful role in the economy. And in some parts of the Arctic, that's true, but in many parts of the Arctic, there just isn't enough extra fish beyond what the existing ecosystem needs and what people and communities rely on. So there's a variety of threats, but they really reflect the different regional realities. And so it requires us to break down our sense that the Arctic is one big place where one narrative fits all, and to really zoom in on each area and understand what it's facing and what it needs.
Thank you. I guess a question we had earlier, we had thought about earlier, was like how the Trump administration has kind of added an impact on what you do and your work.
Yeah, I have a kind of, I'll answer this in maybe a different way. I am of the mind that there are no really new issues in the Arctic. There are renewed issues. The issues of cooperation or conflict or development or conservation, they come and they go every, generation or so. And what happens when the issues, for whatever reason, get put into like our day-to-day consciousness,
Mhm.
it's like a iceberg metaphor. You
Mhm.
see what's above the water,
Mhm.
and that's the news, and that's the like, oh my god, what's happening now?
Mhm.
And then, but below the water
Mhm.
is a much bigger body of energy and connectivity that has been quite durable.
Mhm.
For
Yeah.
example, in the heart of the Cold War, the Bering Sea Pollock Agreement was put into place,
Mhm.
agreeing to
Mhm.
not fish in an area of the Bering Sea that's really important for pollock, and it was jointly enforced by the U.S. and
Mhm.
by the U.S. and Russian navies. In future times, just 5 or 6 years ago, we saw China, Russia, and the United States sign an agreement to not fish in the central Arctic Ocean. And in spite of all and in spite of all the issues that we hear about today,
Mhm.
that agreement is just finished its fifth meeting of the parties where people are actually working well together. And
Mhm.
as we look forward, there isn't really a way to address the issues of sovereignty, of competition in a space where most countries don't have the ability to actually operate. We don't really have the boats, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the infrastructure. So, although those things sort of grab our attention, the reality is that often the most effective and immediate form of sovereignty is conservation. And another example of that is in 1968, the USS Manhattan traversed the Canadian Northwest Passage, challenging the Canadian sovereignty to that. The next year, Prime Minister Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, when he was in office, in response to that, didn't take naval action. He didn't take tariff action. He passed the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, effectively saying, if something goes wrong, who's responsible? And so that sense of making it clear who's responsible has often been the way that things have moved forward in these difficult times.
Mhm. Okay. I was curious, you were talking about like the Canadian government. How much funding does research and conservation in the Arctic get? Is it enough?
I mean, the answer is that it gets it gets more than it did, but not nearly enough because there is an important opportunity to not just protect the places that support the people who rely on those, but to create new conservation economies. And that means creating new connections between community needs. There's a long list of community needs, whether it's mental health or maternity well being or schools or hospitals or roads, and connecting that to actions that are important to safeguard the environment. There are no real connections. Sorry, we often get put in this box where if you want a road, you build a mine. If you
Mhm.
want an addition on your hospital, you drill for oil and gas. But those things don't go together. Those are
Mhm.
just assumed correlations. And so I think this idea of unlocking the full potential of supporting this important region means we need to make new connections, and we need governments that will put significant funding into elevating that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
Was
you.
we're good?
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.